Deborah's fingers danced across her phone screen, a smile curling her lips as she typed the words, "Babe, I can't wait to tell you the good news. Congrats, you're going to be a daddy." The message was sent with a sense of exhilaration as she lounged in the plush leather chair of her lover's apartment. Joseph's cooking filled the air with an intoxicating aroma, the rich scent mingling with the gentle hum of city life beyond the windows. A half-empty glass of velvety red wine rested on the table beside her, the remnants of a relaxing evening. In the warm glow of the moment, Deborah felt untouchable, cocooned in the bubble she and Joseph had created. The world outside seemed distant, her responsibilities and vows to Daniel, her husband of 6 years, blurred in the haze of her secret life. A flicker of guilt tugged at the edges of her thoughts, but she buried it quickly, choosing instead to bask in the fire Joseph reignited in her, a passion she hadn't felt in years. "What's got you smiling like that?" Joseph's voice broke through her reverie. She glanced up at him, his effortless movements in the kitchen a reminder of why she was drawn to him. His charm, his confidence, it was magnetic. He tossed vegetables into a sizzling pan and winked, his grin so infectious that Deborah found herself smiling back without hesitation. "Just sent Daniel a text," she replied with a casual shrug, feigning indifference. Inside, however, a rush of deceit coursed through her, thrilling and unsettling all at once. Joseph chuckled, his tone light and almost mocking. "Poor guy probably thinks you're out shopping with your girlfriends." Deborah didn't correct him. She didn't need to. The tangled web she'd woven between duty and desire was hers alone to navigate. Her phone buzzed, breaking the light-hearted moment. Expecting a simple, sweet response from Daniel, she glanced at the screen. Instead, her heart plummeted. Didn't your lover already hear it? Isn't he a good daddy for your kids? The glass of wine slipped from Deborah's trembling hand, shattering as it hit the floor. The noise jolted her, but it couldn't shake the terror blooming in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. He knows. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Daniel knew everything. Deborah? Joseph's voice was sharp with concern. He was beside her in an instant, his hands resting on her shoulders. What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. I have to go, she stammered, the words tumbling out as panic gripped her. Scrambling for her purse, her hands shook so violently she could barely hold her keys. Whoa, slow down. What's going on? Joseph stepped in front of her, his expression shifting from playful to alarmed. Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel, he knows? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Joseph's jaw tightened, his casual demeanor vanishing. What do you mean he knows? What did he say? Deborah held up her phone, the damning message visible on the screen. Joseph read it, his face hardening. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice low. I don't know. Deborah's voice cracked. Tears welled in her eyes. I need to talk to him. I need to fix this. She pushed past Joseph, urgency propelling her toward the door. His voice followed her. Deborah, wait. You can't just... I'll call you, she muttered, barely audible as she fled into the night. The drive home was a blur. Deborah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, her mind racing with the implications of Daniel's message. The darkened house loomed ahead like a foreboding monument to her sins. No porch light greeted her, Daniel's usual habit of leaving it on conspicuously absent. Stepping inside, the silence was oppressive. Flicking the light switch, she found the power was off. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, the beam casting eerie shadows as she moved through the house. Daniel? Her voice echoed back at her, the empty rooms amplifying her dread. Room by room she searched, finding nothing but emptiness. The bedroom door was ajar. Pushing it open, Deborah's breath hitched. The space was stripped bare. The closet stood empty, hangers swaying slightly as if mocking her. The dresser drawers were pulled out, their contents gone. On the bedside table lay two objects that stole the breath from her lungs, their wedding rings and a note. With trembling hands, Deborah unfolded the crumpled paper. The words scrawled across it were a dagger to her heart. Surprise. I'm going to be a daddy, for your sister's kids. This isn't the end. The note fell from her hands, drifting to the floor as her knees buckled. The weight of Daniel's words crushed her. The betrayal, the heartbreak, it was too much. Her sister Megan. The thought was like a punch to the gut. Nausea rose as the full extent of Daniel's revenge hit her. She paced the empty room, her mind a whirlwind of anguish and desperation. She picked up her phone, scrolling aimlessly through her contacts. But there was no one to call, no one who wouldn't judge her, no one who could undo what had been done. Deborah sank onto the edge of the bed, her tears falling freely. Everything she had built, everything she thought she controlled had come crashing down. The cool night air brushed against Deborah's skin as she stood motionless in her sister Megan's driveway, her car idling behind her like a specter of her crumbling world. The cruel words from Daniel's note rang relentlessly in her mind. Surprise. I'm going to be a daddy for your beautiful sister's kids. Every syllable was a blade, carving into the fragile remnants of her sanity. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door, desperation making her bold. Megan, she shouted, her voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. Open the door. For a moment, nothing happened, and the house loomed ominously before her. Then the door creaked open. Daniel stood there, shirtless, casual, as if he hadn't just eviscerated her life. Beside him was Megan, her face framed by a smug, satisfied smile that sent Deborah's blood boiling. Megan leaned into Daniel, her arms slinking around his waist. The intimacy of the gesture felt like a slap across Deborah's face. Daniel, Deborah's voice cracked. Her eyes darted between her husband and her sister. What is this? Daniel stepped forward, his eyes cold and unrecognizable, devoid of the warmth they once held. You thought you could play your games without consequences? He said, his tone chillingly calm. I'm always 2 steps ahead, Deborah. Always. Megan chimed in with a mocking laugh, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. Oh, don't act so surprised, sis. Did you really think you'd get away with it? Your little fling with Joseph? We knew all along. Deborah stumbled back, her mind spinning. Megan, you knew? How could you? Megan's eyes gleamed with malice as she interrupted. How could I? How could you, Deborah? You thought you were so perfect, so untouchable. But now look at you. She smirked, her voice dripping with venom. You ruined your life, and now it's my turn to shine. Daniel nodded, his face a mask of icy resolve. And I'm done pretending, he said. You destroyed everything we had, and I found someone who actually deserves me. He glanced at Megan, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. Deborah felt her knees weaken, the weight of their betrayal threatening to crush her. Daniel, please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. I still love you. Love? Daniel sneered, his voice like a whip. You don't know the first thing about love. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't betray. You didn't just hurt me, you obliterated everything we built together. Deborah dropped to her knees, her sobs breaking the oppressive silence of the night. I'm sorry, she whispered. Please don't do this. Megan's laughter rang out again, cruel and victorious. Look at you now, she said, her voice brimming with satisfaction. Begging like a broken little doll. The mighty Deborah brought to her knees. Deborah looked up at her sister, her vision blurred by tears. You're my sister, Megan. How could you do this to me? Megan's smile only widened. Because it's time you learned what it feels like to be second best. You've had everything handed to you your whole life. Now it's my turn. Daniel crouched in front of Deborah, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. This is your reality now, Deborah. You made your bed. Now lie in it. With that, he stood, taking Megan's hand. Together, they stepped back inside the house, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the still night. Deborah remained on the cold ground, sobbing as the full weight of her actions suffocated her. She had lost Daniel. She had lost Megan. And now she had lost herself. Weeks later, the days blurred together into an unrelenting haze of regret and solitude. The home that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum, every corner a reminder of what she had lost. Deborah sat on the couch, her fingers clutching her phone as she dialed Joseph's number for what felt like the 100th time. The call didn't even ring. Instead, the automated message cut through the silence. The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service. You coward, Deborah muttered, hurling the phone across the room. It struck the wall and fell to the floor with a thud. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her parents had disowned her. Her friends had abandoned her, most siding with Daniel. Even Joseph had disappeared without a trace, leaving her utterly alone. One by one, the people in her life had turned their backs. Her mother's last words echoed in her mind, "This is your mess, Deborah. Fix it yourself." She had tried to hold herself together, but the cracks were too deep. Every moment was a reminder of her failure, of the life she had destroyed with her own hands. And then there was Daniel and Megan, together, smiling, thriving. They flaunted their relationship openly, twisting the knife deeper every chance they got. One afternoon, Deborah found herself outside a cafe she and Daniel had once frequented. Through the window she saw them, Daniel and Megan, laughing, their hands intertwined. Megan leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, a picture of bliss. Deborah's breath caught in her throat as the scene played out before her. She pressed a hand to the cold glass, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it was real. Her life had become a nightmare of her own making, and there was no waking up. She had gambled everything on a moment of passion and lost it all. Now, all she had left was the crushing weight of regret and the echoes of a life she could never reclaim. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of rain as Deborah stood outside the house that had once been her sanctuary. Her soaked clothes clung to her shivering frame, the cold biting through her thin jacket. This house, her former home, now felt like a distant memory, glowing warmly from within as if mocking her with its newfound vitality. Each step toward the door felt like a step into the abyss, yet she couldn't turn back. She had to try even if she was already drowning in her own despair. The door opened slowly and there he was. Daniel stood tall and composed, his features illuminated by the soft glow of the hallway light. He looked different, stronger somehow, as though the weight of their fractured marriage had been lifted from his shoulders. His eyes, once warm and inviting, now held a cool indifference that sent a shiver down her spine. Deborah's breath hitched as she took in the sight of him, her heart breaking all over again. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation, "please, can we talk?" Daniel's eyes swept over her rain-soaked figure, a flicker of something, perhaps pity, crossing his face before it was replaced with a hardened expression. He crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, his stance guarded. "There's nothing to talk about, Deborah," he said flatly, his tone devoid of emotion. Deborah took a hesitant step forward, her feet dragging as though the ground beneath her were trying to swallow her whole. The rain blurred her vision, mingling with the tears she couldn't stop. "I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice cracking. "But we can fix this. I'll do anything. Please, just give me a chance." For a moment, Daniel was silent, his gaze unflinching as it bore into hers. Then he let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head slowly. "A chance?" he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "Now, after everything?" Deborah flinched as though his words were physical blows, but she pressed on, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It wasn't worth losing you. I know that now. I wasn't thinking, Daniel. I was selfish and stupid, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I just want things to go back to how they were." Daniel's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as his eyes glimmered with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You want to go back?" he said, his voice low and sharp. "To what? To the life you shattered? To the trust you destroyed?" He stepped closer, his gaze piercing through her. "You took everything good and pure in our marriage and tore it apart. And now you think we can just pretend none of it happened." Deborah's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the wet concrete porch, her knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. She didn't care about the cold or the rain, all she could feel was the suffocating weight of her guilt. She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm begging you, Daniel. Please. I can't do this without you." For a brief moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the patter of rain on the porch. Daniel's face softened, but it wasn't the softness of hope or forgiveness. It was pity, cold, unrelenting pity, and the realization twisted in Deborah's chest like a knife. She had wanted him to be angry, to shout, to fight. Anything but this detached, distant gaze that made her feel like a ghost of the woman she used to be. Daniel knelt down, his movements deliberate, until his eyes were level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was low but resolute, each word cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Deborah," he said softly, "I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt. I'm just done." The finality of his words stole the air from her lungs. She reached out, her trembling hand brushing his knee as if trying to anchor herself to him, to the life they had shared. But Daniel stood, brushing her hand away as gently as if she were a fragile piece of glass. He straightened, his eyes never leaving hers. "You need to move on," he said firmly. "Like I have." With that, Daniel turned and stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the latch echoed in the cold, rainy night, leaving Deborah kneeling on the porch, drenched and broken. She stared at the closed door, the world around her fading into the shadows as the reality of his words crashed over her like a wave. The rain poured harder, mingling with her tears, but she didn't move. She was frozen in place, her mind racing with the cruel truth. This was the end. There was no going back. And yet, even in the depths of her despair, a small, flickering thought took root in her mind. One day she would stand again. One day she would rebuild. Because no matter how shattered she was now, she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The rain cascaded down in relentless sheets, soaking Deborah to the bone as she knelt on the porch. Her trembling hands clutched at the hem of Daniel's pants, a desperate attempt to hold onto the man who had once been her entire world. Her voice cracked, raw and pleading. Please, Daniel, don't leave me. Don't leave me like this. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me alone. Daniel's expression remained steady, but his eyes revealed a flicker of sorrow that he quickly suppressed. He gently pulled his leg free from her grasp, stepping back to create a space that felt as wide as a chasm. His voice was calm but edged with finality. You left me long before this, Deborah. You chose this path. You made your bed and now you have to lie in it. The words struck her like a blow, leaving her breathless as fresh sobs racked her body. She stayed there on the cold, wet ground, her tears mixing with the rain as she watched him turn and step back into the house. The door shut with a soft click, a sound so faint and yet so final that it echoed in her mind like a thunderclap. It was over. Truly irrevocably over. For a long moment, Deborah remained frozen, her hands pressed against the damp concrete. The porch light flickered weakly above her, casting an eerie glow on her drenched and trembling frame. She stared at the closed door, willing it to reopen for Daniel to come back and tell her it wasn't too late. But the house remained silent, the warm light inside mocking her with its cheerfulness. Slowly, she forced herself to her feet, her limbs heavy with the weight of her despair. The walk back to her car felt interminable, each step dragging her further into a darkness she couldn't escape. By the time she reached the driver's seat, she could no longer hold back the sobs that clawed their way up her throat. She slumped forward, her forehead pressing against the steering wheel as her body shook with the force of her anguish. The rain drummed relentlessly against the windshield, drowning out her cries as she allowed herself to unravel completely. The rise of a new dawn. In the years that followed, Daniel's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. The searing pain of betrayal that had once consumed him slowly dulled, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. Bit by bit, he rebuilt himself, learning to trust again, both in others and in the man he was becoming. Then came Sophia. They met by chance at a charity event Daniel had only attended out of obligation. Sophia's warm smile and easy laugh drew him in immediately, though he had been hesitant to let anyone into his heart again. But Sophia was patient. She never pushed, giving him the space he needed to heal. It was that quiet understanding that eventually made him fall for her. 2 years later, they married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by the family and friends who had seen Daniel through his darkest days. Soon after, Sophia gave birth to their daughter Lily. Parenthood had once been a dream Daniel feared would never come true, but holding Lily in his arms for the first time erased every lingering shadow of his past. His days became filled with laughter and love, his heart lighter than it had been in years. A chance encounter. One sunny afternoon, Daniel found himself strolling through the park with Sophia and Lily. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the rustle of leaves. Lily toddled ahead, her tiny hands reaching for a butterfly that danced just out of reach. She's growing up so fast, Sophia said, her voice soft with affection as she watched their daughter. Daniel chuckled, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Don't remind me. I'm still getting used to her walking on her own. The moment was perfect, a snapshot of the life Daniel had worked so hard to build. But as they rounded a corner, his gaze landed on a figure sitting alone on a weathered bench. Deborah. Time had not been kind to her. Her once radiant beauty was dimmed, replaced by a tired, worn expression. Her clothes hung loosely on her frame and her hair, once meticulously styled, now fell limply around her face. She sat slumped, her gaze distant as though weighed down by a lifetime of regrets. For a brief moment, their eyes met. In that fleeting connection, Daniel saw the ghost of the woman he had once loved. But she was no longer the vibrant, confident Deborah he had known. Regret and sorrow clung to her like a shroud, and he felt a pang of something unexpected, pity. Deborah held his gaze, her eyes silently pleading, for recognition, forgiveness, or perhaps just a moment of acknowledgement. But Daniel couldn't offer her any of those things. The man she had known no longer existed, and the life they had shared was nothing more than a distant memory. He turned away, his hand tightening around Sophia's. Are you okay? She asked, sensing the subtle shift in his mood. Daniel glanced down at her, his smile soft but assured. I'm better than okay, he said, his voice steady. As they continued down the path, Lily's laughter guiding their steps, Daniel glanced back one last time. Deborah hadn't moved. Her gaze was fixed on the ground now, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of her choices had become unbearable. Deborah's reckoning. Alone on the bench, Deborah sat motionless, her mind replaying the moments that had brought her here. The affair. The lies. The betrayal. Each decision had been a thread, weaving the tapestry of her downfall. She had alienated everyone who mattered, leaving her with nothing but memories and regrets. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling as the realization settled over her. She had made her bed and she was lying in it. As Daniel and his family disappeared into the distance, Deborah remained frozen in place, the echoes of their laughter a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. For him, the day was another chapter in a life filled with love and light. For her, it was a reminder of the road she could never walk again.